Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, Kushalmehra. All right, today's discussion is designed and created by Shri Abhijit Ayyar Mitra. So when we were on Sham Sharma's show, Abhijit ordered me, "Hey Kushal, humko ye discussion karna padega," and we are doing the discussion as Abhijit had ordered. So today's discussion is why India couldn't defeat the Turkic invaders. So Abhijit, I don't need to welcome you because you're a regular member of the podcast. So here's my question first up to you. Why do you think this topic per se deserves a detailed analysis?
It deserves a detailed analysis for two reasons. Because it shows you what an important role dependence on imports, military thinking, not adapting your strategy to what is available and pining after imports, as well as the caste system inflict on you. Okay, useless division of labor inflicts on you. And it is still such a relevant lesson, it's not even funny.
Okay, so now let me lay it out like this, right? So my first question to you is going to be, so India has had, I'm not going to get into the controversy of whether there was a Aryan invasion or not. I'm going to leave it aside because I'm someone who's skeptical about it. So let's leave that aside. But India has had a series of invasions, right? India has had invasions over a period of at least 2,500 years. And India even had, we cannot deny that the people from the Pontic steppes did enter India because genetics is clear on that. Whether it was an invasion or whether it was assimilation is a separate issue. But there have been series of people coming into India. Well, the first set came 70,000 years ago, which are the Andamanese, the original people. Then we had a significant entry into India 7,000 years ago. And then there is a series of people who have come into India. So we need to decipher what was an invasion and what was just a migration of people. So within invasions, why do we focus on the Turks? Because there have been the British who have come into India. So let's say if I was to ask you what is so unique about the Turkic invasion, say in comparison to the British.
So, look, we're all Africans, right? We all came out of Africa. So it doesn't matter where we come from. Our ancestor was a chimpanzee some kind of a chimpanzee in the Rift Valley in Kenya. Now, why are the Turks different? Because remember that Muslim Turks weren't the first Turkic people to invade us. We think the Shakas and the Hunas were, kind of somewhere related to those steppe nomads. There was certainly anybody coming in from the steppes would have the same lifestyle. Okay, essentially they would be part of a similar lifestyle continuum. So what happens here is, why are these people different? Because they never absorbed into society. They constantly had a foreign identification. Instead of looking at India as a culturally superior country and adapting to being Indian very, very quickly, they were Persianate, and they never actually adapted to a sedentary lifestyle in that sense. The idea of running the economy based on a Raubenwirtschaft, a war economy, a combat economy, where all surpluses are gained through raiding your neighbors, becomes much, much more acute during this period. Right. So you look at the only real, the Shakas, it's still out there. Shakas may not have been Turkic, even though they're from the Pontic steppes. But the Hunas, Toroman and Mihrakula, even the name itself has a very Turkic ring to it. But they say Mihrakula and Toroman were great Shiva Bhaktas. Right. So they may have been nasty, cruel people, because that is the way steppe warfare happens. That is why there is a certain connotation Why is it that you don't associate the cruelty of the Shaka or the Huna invasions with, say, the Kushans, who were also from, say, Uzbekistan or northern Afghanistan, which is a kind of like a continuum? So clearly there is something to do with nomadic populations, their lifestyle, their type of warfare. Where these differ from the Shakas and the Hunas is just the sheer rapine, cruelty, the indoctrination, the ideology, uh, and the economic mismanagement.
So here's the thing, Abhijit. So before the Turks, right, there were people who came in, but we were able to defeat them. And the ones who came in, they kind of assimilated into the society. It was not like so. Even in fact, I don't want to piss people off, but even when the Greeks came in, the ones who stayed back eventually assimilated into Indian society. They became a part of us. In fact, there's a beautiful book by Thomas Machiavelli, The Shape of Ancient Thought, that actually talks about the philosophy, the Greek philosophy and Indian philosophy, how India influenced Greek philosophy. Most people don't realize that Greek monism is not original. It is actually influenced from the Upanishadic thought. So anybody who reads Parmenides, like I'll give you, when I was reading my philosophy books and I started reading Parmenides, I was like, hang on, this is like Gaudapada's Advaita all over. I mean, what is so different? And then I started digging more and more and more, and I was like, oh, so ye yahan se wahan aa gaya tha. But then I also realized that the Greeks also gave us a lot of things like astrology. Like the first book itself is called Yavana Jataka. Now this happens with everyone, but something goes awry with the Turks. They do not absorb, and we also do not defeat them. So why
Correct.
are these two factors so unique in these people, the Turks?
So this is where we have to separate ethnicity from religion, right? So you look at when the Greeks invaded, the accounts of Alexander's invasion. Now, I'm just setting aside if Porus won the Battle of the Hydaspes or Alexander did, because that's another minefield I don't want to get into here. But what happens is Alexander coming here, he actively seeks out Indian philosophers, right? He goes to temples of, supposedly goes to a temple of Krishna and worships him as his ancestor Hercules, right? You look at the Greeks even after the Greek invasion of Egypt. Alexander accepted the Egyptian gods. He was seen as the pharaoh of Egypt. They worshipped, even his successors, the Ptolemies. They worshipped at Egyptian temples. They were great bhaktas of Ra and Osiris and Hathor and things like that. And you look at the way pre-Christian Mediterranean religions synthesized each other. Rome, when Greece then becomes a Roman province and Egypt becomes a Roman province, Roman Venus is seen as Greek Aphrodite, who is seen as Egyptian Isis. They were all interchangeable. You didn't go around destroying each other's temples. You cherished each other's cultures. You didn't have any qualms about absorbing each other's cultures, right? In fact, the word Christ and hero, Greek words, are of Indian origin. People don't realize this, but Christ, technically Christ's name is Yeshua bin Yusuf, Jesus the son of Joseph, right? And the word Jesus Christos is Yeshua the anointed. Christos is anointed. Where does that come from? Ghee. So ghee, when we used to use it in our homas, you say the prayer holding ghee in your hand, you pour it into the sacrificial fire so that it goes up into the heavens. But this is now holy ghee. So what you do is you put a tika off there, and that is the anointing process. So grita grey asta. Okay, grey, old word for ghee, asta. You've been anointed. That slowly becomes Christ in Greek. Hero is the same as Virya. Vira, hero. Right? Now, the old world was completely syncretic. Imagine Persia, which should technically be demon worshippers for us. We were demon worshippers for them. They literally worship the asuras. We literally worship the devas. For them, devas are the asuras. Devas are the demons.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
they don't come around destroying our temples. We don't go around destroying their fire temples.
Yeah.
Right. So what's happening out here? Right. So there's clearly something that is different. And this is where it is not the ethnicity that's important. This is where the banal influence of monotheism, and specifically Islam in this case, plus the inferiority complex of a lesser Muslim comes in. Because, remember, when the Arabs invaded Persia and the Arabs invaded Egypt, they actually went to extra lengths to prevent people from converting to Islam, because that means you don't have to pay the jizya, number one. And what then happens is, if you convert, the revenue of the state decreases because you're not getting jizya, because when you don't pay jizya, you substitute military duty. And they didn't want a non-Muslim doing military service and therefore undermining the state. What if a non-Muslim acquired power, kind of thing? So it had several elements to it. But the moment the Turks become Muslim, what you see is you have a particular expansionist ideology, a sort of, not just expansionist, also a proselytizing ideology.
Exclusivist?
That means exclusivist, yes, but more proselytizing, because see, they want to absorb you. And you see that in the way the Turks adopt Persian. At one point of time, Persian used to be the official language of the Ottoman Empire as well. There were almost no Turkic empires that did not adopt Persian as their official language. We'll come to that later on in this podcast. So we'll talk about how the Ottomans shifted from Persian as the language of governance to Turkish as the language of governance. But what happens here is you have a lifestyle that needs expansion, that needs raiding, that needs cruelty, meet with a theology that perfectly suits that ideology. Because remember, Arabia was very similar. You look at Arabia and you look at the Pontic steppe. They are both ideal for horses. They are both prone to extreme climate change and climate change-induced depredations. They are both highly prone to resource constraints and consequent raider economies, Raubenwirtschaft. The Arabs, on the other hand, civilized very, very, very quickly. They became sedentary extremely rapidly. The Turks did not. And why? Because there were consistent pressure coming. It was we don't know why. It starts off sometime around the 4th century AD, when another branch of the Huns attacks Germany and Europe and the Roman Empire. And from there on, there is clearly some climate change happening. The 4th century se leke 12th, 13th century tak, there is constant population pressure happening from the Altai Mountains westwards and southwards. Right? So now, what is the cause for this? It's probably climate change, we think, but there's no establishment of what it is, primarily because these were all illiterate tribes. They didn't have a script. There is no archaeological evidence of them, because, nomadic people will seldom have archaeological remains and things like that. So we don't really know what to do about it. And there's constant population pressure, push. So all of these get into a very toxic combination in that sense. Plus this belief that Persian is somehow superior to native Indian forms. And that exclusivity also comes from their conversion to Islam.
Yeah, so that's very interesting because I've heard many people talk about this, which I've always found it very hard to digest. That whenever you talk about exclusivism of monotheism, for the ones who don't like monotheism, eventually, actually, what they put everything on. Actually, uh, I mean, I understand that monotheism is a byproduct of Zoroastrianism in a weird way. Anybody who has read the Zen Avesta will understand that. I mean, it's kind of understood where
but
from where
but
they
but
go.
Kushal, we need to be very careful that Zoroastrianism is henotheistic. It's not
Yeah, yeah, I know.
monotheistic.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
exactly. That's what I was
it,
gonna say. So it's actually unfair
it,
on
it,
them to
it
blame it on them. But then here's my
exactly.
point, Abhijit.
But what you can blame it on is Artanism in Egypt.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Okay, because remember, Akhenaten is the world's first monotheist,
Hmm.
and like the world's first monotheist, he displays extraordinary intolerance. It's one of the most horrific periods in Egypt's history, to
Hmm.
such an extent that his own son, Tutankhaten, has to change his name to Tutankhamun and authorize the destruction of every one of his father's monuments, has to completely flatten his father's capital, orders his father's name to be scrubbed out of every monument, chiseled out of every monument. And the hatred lasts so much that Horemheb, Tutankhamun's general who takes over after killing Tutankhamun, has to wipe out even Tutankhamun's name, even though Tutankhamun had converted back from Artanism to Amunism.
Hmm.
And Akhenaten starts off as a henotheist. When he's in co-regency with his father, the moment he becomes the sole pharaoh, he changes over to absolute monotheism.
Hmm.
Monotheism breeds fanaticism. Okay,
Couldn't
this
agree
is
more.
uh, I don't know, I can't prove causation, but there is a very, very strong correlation here. Nothing else explains the Amarna period in the Egyptian New Kingdom.
Yeah, so now let's get into the sociological factors. And now I think is the perfect time to discuss the one thing which I believe has to be the single most. So now, because you said we want to talk about language too, so let's take this section of the podcast and let us talk about the Persian language. It's very ironical now. Right now, I'm on Patreon. I'm actually discussing this book called the Indo-European Controversy, Facts and Fallacies, and it's obviously on linguistics and how language is adopted. And here's the thing, Abhijit. So try and understand my point of view. A lot of claims that linguists make are actually not on very firm ground.
Absolutely.
This is not I'm not trying to play the out of India hypothesis up. I am genuinely agnostic, and anybody who knows me will know that. But the point is that a lot of times, they give you these ideas like the elite hypothesis. Is the elite hypothesis somewhat plausible? Yes, but there are many cases in the history of the human race where the elite hypothesis does not work, where a lot of times the people who invade landmass, they end up taking the language of the people of that landmass, and they don't adopt that language. But having said that, what is so unique about the Persian language? Because I want to get into many more sociological factors. So let's first discuss language, because I believe in this entire discussion, I believe language plays a humongous role.
So, several reasons. See, there is a certain trajectory in the way languages get absorbed. So, for example, when you have the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Celtic Gaelic Britain, uh, Celtic gets wiped out completely. British becomes a 100% Germanic language to such an extent. This is why, the story of the Viking raids on Britain are such complete bullshit. Because, the British at that time were completely intelligible word for word to the invading Vikings. Because the Anglo-Saxons came from the same areas that the Vikings came from. Right? Just a few hundred years earlier, so the languages hadn't diverged that much. It was maybe like speaking Bengali and Hindi, which are kind of mutually almost completely intelligible, or say Marathi and Hindi, or Punjabi and Hindi, right? So what happens there is, first wave completely replaces the second wave, but then when you have the when the Norman invasion of Britain happens, you see something very different. It's the invader that slowly adopts the language of the invaded, of the occupied. The occupier adopts the language of the occupied, but the language of the occupied changes so much that even today, 45% of the vocabulary of English is of French origin. Right? So, in simple majority, English is actually, technically, it would be a Romance language in my classification, not a Germanic language. So, now let's look at how this works with the Turks and Persia. Now, remember, the Arab writing script prior to this was an Aramaic script. And it was very similar to the Aramaic script that Persia used. So you look at the earliest Quran ever written, which we know that has been dated. I actually had the honor of seeing it in Tashkent. It's kept in the museum, and it's opened on the page where Caliph Uthman was killed, because he was supposedly reading this Quran, and his head was smashed in with a skull or a sword from the back, and the blood stain goes like that across the Quran. I've actually tweeted an image of it, one of the pages of it. I actually want you to go check my Twitter timeline on this. I have an image of that thing opened up. That's written in Kufic. Okay, that was the Aramaic native to Kufa in Iraq. That becomes the script of Arabic. So remember, what we call the Arabic script is actually an Iraqi script. It's an Iraqi variation of Aramaic that the Arabs used to use to write their language before. But what's more important is Aramaic was also the written script of the Persian Empire. So in that sense, the Persianization of the Arabs happened extremely early. Why? Because when a nomad meets a civilized empire with a large bureaucracy, extremely well-heeled government, bureaucracies tend to absorb, the same way Narendra Modi has effectively become the head of the IAS. You know, the joke is that it's a IAS government with outside support from the BJP. It was kind of like that. It was sort of a Persian government with military support from the Arabs in that sense. Which is why you have Arabs complaining very early on that, these people, they ran their empire without a single Arab for 1,000 years. We can't run our empire for a single day without a Persian running it. So yeah, it's the absorption. It is not the Persian language. It is not the greatness of Persia per se. It is the Persian IAS. It is the Persian bureaucracy that reverse conquers the Arabs. And why was it the Persian bureaucracy and not the Byzantine bureaucracy? Because remember, Byzantium had a very efficient bureaucracy in the Levant, so the Holy Land, Syria, Israel, as well as in Egypt, which was also a Byzantine province at that point of time. Why? Because they didn't control the imperial capital. They didn't capture Constantinople. You need to capture the central government in order to absorb the bureaucracy. Otherwise, like bureaucrats are trying to constantly, bring down the Modi government or hobble it in some way or form, because we all know all these journalists are bureaucrat ke bachches. You will have the same thing. You'll have the same bureaucrat ke bachches doing to the Modi government what the Byzantine bureaucrats did to the Arab government, which is why they had to be replaced wholesale. On the other hand, when you capture the entire Persian bureaucracy, the state of governance, the changes are very profound. Then comes the glorification of language. Now, remember, the language, it's quite surprising, because what happens is, in Persia during the Parthian period, the Arsacid dynasty that ended around 250 AD or around that much, they used to speak a lot of Greek. Greek had kind of colonized the Greek mindset, Greek plays had colonized Persia. And the Sassanids pushed back against that very, very, very strongly. The Sassanid period was a period of religious renaissance where Zoroastrianism turns very intolerant, unlike the Achaemenid and the Parthian period. And it also turns very linguistic nationalistic. So what happens here is it's that glory of Iran kind of thing which the Persian bureaucracy indoctrinates into you, that the Turks come into. And because these guys are Muslims and the Iranians are the one who civilized. So Iran and Turan. Turan is Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, parts of northern Afghanistan. So Iran anyway had a significant linguistic influence on Turan by that point of time. So it was just a question of adopting religion in addition to already adopting their language, which had become sort of the lingua franca of that particular Iran-Turan region. Right? This is the root of Persianization. But look at the trajectory that this takes. It's very, very curious. Iran and Egypt are two countries that for the last 2,000 years have seldom been ruled over by Iranians or Egyptians. They've actually been ruled over by Turks. So,
Yeah,
Turks,
actually, that's
out of
true.
1,400 years, so out of 1,400 years of Muslim history, only about 200 to 250 years are Arab history. The remaining 1,250 years are Turkish history. So much so that Egypt becomes a Turkic state in 850 AD. The Tulunids take over. And this is, the slave soldier system, where you capture slaves, sell them off, and they become your military slaves. Iran had a brief interlude after the Sassanids. It's called the Iranian Intermezzo, which again happens around 850 with the Buyids and the Samanids and things like that. But except for those 100 years and the Fatimid Caliphate immediately after the Tulunids, so slight 100-year gap, it's foreign rulers all over again. So Egypt by this time, for 2,000 years more, for about Egypt, at least for 2,500 years, has not had an Egyptian ruler till Abdel Gamal Nasser takes over. Imagine a civilization like Egypt not having a native son of the soil ruling it for 2,500 years. Persia is different. After the Sassanids, you have a 70 to 100-year Iranian intermezzo. All their other rulers, the Safavids, the Qajars, the Nadir Shah, Nadir Shah is called the Afrashid dynasty. They are all Turks. Not one, they are all from Turan, they are not from Iran. Right? So what happens is this comes to an head during the Safavid Ottoman period. These are both essentially Turkoman tribes, so Western Oghuz. So if you look at the Turkic languages, there's Kipchak, which is the north, which is Kazakhstan. There is Karluk, which is the eastern Turkic languages, that is Uyghur and Uzbek. And there's Turkoman Oghuz, which is the western Turkic languages, which is Turkmen, Turkoman, Azeri, and Turkish proper. Now, what happens here is you have the Seljuk Empire that comes around 900, 800, 900 AD, which is basically combines Persia and Anatolia, so Turkey and Persia. And what happens here is that the language becomes Persian. Right? Now, so the Seljuks are not part of the Iranian national memory. They are part of the Turkish identity, the modern Turkish identity and the modern Turkish identity memory, even though none of the Seljuk capitals was actually in Turkey. All the Seljuk capitals were bloody in Iran. Right? So what happens is when this fragmentation happens, You finally, around the 1400s, you have the the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire, which are fighting for control for what was once Seljuk territory. What happens here is, these are both Turkoman tribes essentially, and what happens is, one is Shia, the Safavids, one is Sunni, but they both speak Turkic. They're both actively trying to proselytize each other. And the Safavids are defeated very, very badly at the Battle of Chaldiran. And what happens after that is particularly interesting. The Battle of Chaldiran is so important in terms of how the national identities of Turkey and Persia, it, it was actually a gift to Persia, because then it started the de-Turkification of Persia by a Turkic dynasty. Why? Because you both Turkomans, how do you differentiate yourself? Because your ordinary people are, bhai, ye bhi Turkoman hai, wo bhi Turkoman hai. This is a choice between Turkoman and Turkoman. Ye Shia hai, ye Sunni hai. What is the additional differentiator? In Europe, it was the 1300s and the 1400s, remember, the 100 Years' War, that consolidated the French and the British national identity, the linguistic identity. And it's not that these two countries actually studied that model, but it happens simultaneously in this part of the world as well, that Turkey actively decides it wants to de-Persianize its leadership. And so within about 50 years of the Battle of Chaldiran, they change over from Farsi to Turkish as the language of the state. And it sent shockwaves in India, because the Indian sultans and co could not believe that a Turk would be so uncivilized as to make Turkic the national language. It was actually a court scandal in India. 100 years later, the Mughals were complaining about this, saying they've gone back to Jahiliya and shit like that. Right? In Iran, they're very proud of their language. So what happens is, there is this deliberate emphasis on de-Turkifying the Turks in Iran. The way they separate themselves is to draw back that lineage to their pre-Islamic heritage and show it as continuity. So the religious nationalism solidifies. But also what happens is, a concocted Persian identity starts coming about, even though none of the rulers are Persian. Okay? So these are the two parallel processes you see purely as a result of the coming out because of the Battle of Chaldiran and its consequences thereon. What's particularly interesting in all of this is, you start seeing the change in art. And that is particularly interesting. You look at the early Persian miniatures, say starting from about 800 to about 1200, 1300, and Seljuk and Ottoman art as seen in tile work and things like that, but also in manuscripts. All the people depicted, all the kings and queens depicted, have Sinitic features, Mongol features. The slant eye is very, very pronounced in all of them. So the Sinitic, but sometime around the 1400s, the portraits change. Right? None of them have these Mongol features anymore. They start having the features you associate today with modern day Turkey and modern day Iran, which is not Mongol. Right? Even though the ruling class remains Turkic and claims a Turkic heritage. So you're seeing all these processes happen. Now, very important in this entire process happening is what's happening in India at this point of time, right? Because we're not facing this do or die battle, we're not facing this sort of battle for supremacy over a contiguous whole, The Turkish identity remains the Turkish identity. It never changes. So imagine you're in this country, you start in 1192, and right up to the end of the Mughal Empire, you are fixated with your Turco-Mongol identity. And it's very curious watching programs like Ertugrul, because they actually show you, oh, these horrible Mongols coming in and killing all our people, and we are so different. All the Turks are shown as modern day Turks, all the Mongols are shown as Mongols. That is such a joke, because the bulk of the Mongol army was Turkish. The Mongols were actually something like 15 to 20% of the Mongol army. The bulk of it was actually Turkish. It was actually Turks fighting Turks. So, there's this joke after the Second World War, in the Cold War, because all the German scientists were split. Russia took a number of German scientists and America took a number of German scientists. So the Russian space program and the American space program were started by captured German scientists. And the joke was, it was my Germans versus your Germans. And that's what the entire bloody Mongol invasion was. It was my Turks versus your Turks. The Turks did the most of the dying and the fighting. So there's actually these cases when Genghis Khan is destroying the Khwarezmi Empire. When some of the cities surrender, they're astounded that they've been ordered to be slaughtered, because they're like, dude, we're Turkish like you. How are you ordering a katleam? They can't get it. So it's these are the dynamics happening out there. Now, let's get to the military, because Mr. Lee in the comments makes this point, which we're going to hit on. We didn't have enough horses. Horses were a luxury. That's the thinking that led us to lose. So, Kushal, you frame it any way you want, but we need to get into the military side.
So before I get into the military side of things, I still want to stick to one aspect of the sociological thing. So we have discussed the sociological factors outside India. But look, whenever you invade, there are multiple variables. Even within the sociological realm, there are variables outside India, but there are variables inside India. There has to be something that was brewing in India, which has to make India into a particular basket case, where if a type of person comes from outside, yes, I get it, there is the military factor, and we will get to the military factor, but there are certain sociological and societal realities that enable this kind of an invasion, and it can so ex outsider can come in and take advantage of inside realities. Now people hate me whenever I point out to the, you don't want to call it caste, don't call it caste, you can call it jati varna or whatever, but there is a reality out there which even genetics proves that India is, I mean, not a, it's far less now, but India had, in my view, after the Jew, the Hasidic Jews, I think we have the largest endogamous population in the world, where people just don't marry outside their jati, which is extremely weird. I mean, I don't know how we have pulled it off, but at least the genetic data from the last 2000 years clearly says that हमारे लोग आपस में शादी करने से मना करते हैं. हम बोलते हैं नहीं शादी करूंगा तुझसे. So in a scenario like this, where you have a society that is becoming increasingly rigid, I am not saying that it was as rigid 2000, the start point of the year 2000, before the 2000 years before this, or till when the Turks come. But the point is, and I'm even willing to concede that the Turkish entry even accelerates this endogamous thinking in our society. But the point is, we did have fissures. So how much of the role does this Jati Varna matrix make it easier for the Turks in coming into India?
So I don't know if it accelerates it or if it enters at a point where it's already accelerated. Because remember, during the Maurya period and the Gupta period, we have mentions of caste and some caste discrimination as well, but it doesn't seem as endemic as it becomes during the Harsha period. Okay, during the Harshavardhana Chalukya period. Now, clearly what's happening is, at this point, a large part of society is getting stratified based on caste. Number one. And that's never a good idea when your opponent runs a cratocracy. What is a cratocracy? Might is right. So, what happens is, there, if a leader dies, the next leader is as good of a military leader as the previous leader. They have built in redundancy mechanisms. And in fact, when the top leader is killed, treacherously betrayed by his successor, it usually means the successor is even better militarily than the guy he replaced. So you see this with, the Battle of Ain Jalut, where it's the first proper defeat of the Mongols by the Turkic army of Egypt, by Sultan Qutuz. And he's killed on his way back by Baibars, Baibars Bandukdari, the first person known to have owned a gun, the first king to have known to have owned and operated a gun, hence Bandukdari, Ruknuddin Baibars Bandukdari. And this is accepted, which is why the Delhi Sultanates are so unstable. But notice, even in the Delhi Sultanates, each successor is just as military capable as, more or less, as militarily capable as the predecessor. So you have Qutbuddin Aibak, who is extremely successful, Iltutmish, who is even more successful. Then you have 2 or 3 useless rulers, and then you have Balban, who is extremely successful. Then you have few more rulers, and then you have the Khiljis, who are again extremely successful. Right, so there is a ossifying society in India that is not promoting based on merit or power, but rather based on birth, confronted by an extremely violent, brutal society, which is promoting based purely on military virtue. Jahan hatya is accepted, it is societally accepted for you to kill the sultan in order to gain power. So, when Genghis Khan is destroying the Khwarezmi Empire, and Jalaluddin Mingbornu, who's the Khwarezm Shah's son, comes into India, and he asks Iltutmish for asylum, Iltutmish says, you know what? Our ancestors believe that might is right. So if Genghis Khan is defeated and destroyed you, it clearly means you're a rotter who deserves to be defeated and destroyed. So, Iltutmish didn't even feel that particular kinship with Jalaluddin Mingbornu, because he possibly saw the Mongols for exactly what they were, which is a Turkic army. So for him, it was like Abdul and Abdul fighting. भाई अब्दुल की लड़ाई हो रही है, मैं किस अब्दुल को चूज करूं? Okay, so this is one aspect. So caste plays a very important role in this, an ossification of society versus an extremely dynamic society. Now, if you want to put this another way, a traditionalist would get very angry with this classification, and he'd say ours was a traditional society and theirs was an immoral, violent society. Also true, but that is the price you pay for tradition. Understand that. That was purely a meritocratic society, not economically meritocratic. They did not know how to run the economy, fine. But they knew it was a military meritocracy. Okay? This is number one. Keep this at the back of your mind. We don't know what's happening between the 4th century and the 7th century. We know there is massive de-urbanization in North India. And we don't know what this is. It's the climate change related event that every empire has de-urbanized by this time. Rome has de-urbanized, Byzantium has de-urbanized, Sassanid Persia has de-urbanized, India has de-urbanized. There are cities. Don't confuse having cities with de-urbanization. They're two completely different things. You have great cities like Mathura, but you are de-urbanized. Okay? We don't know why this is happening, but it's happening. And then there is Eurocentrism, because invariably barbarians are always militarily more flexible than a sedentary civilization. This is one more thing that's happening. Now, what is caste exacerbating? Caste exacerbates peacockery. And by peacockery, I mean this need for status symbols associated with your caste. And in this case, what is the status symbol do you think that's associated with caste superiority? Guess.
It's very hard to think at that point of time. Tell me.
Think. It's Vedic, man.
Well, I mean, I think it's just a purity and pollution issue. If you think,
No. Militarily.
militarily is very hard. It's just I can't think
The
of
horse.
it right now. Oh yeah,
The
yeah.
horse.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because you're elevating somebody over the ordinary foot soldier. So it's a sign of caste and status superiority, number one.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, remember, we don't have meadows, so we don't have horses. We were never able to produce horses in India, which is why even in the Rig Veda, horses are they are the animal of the Rig Veda, not the cow, the horse. The horse is venerated above everybody else. Ashva. Tunga. Right? And that is why the horse sacrifice, the Ashwamedha Yagya, is such an important thing, because everything is compared to the horse. It is rare, it exists, but it is extremely rare. And now it turns, this obsession with the horse turns suicidal. Because this is where you start relying on a military import. And instead of optimizing your infantry strategy, which is always what you were good at, you go in for the foolishness of cavalry tactics, which you do not have. Right? It's the only other kind of cavalry you have is the elephant corps, but elephants aren't as disciplined as horses. Elephants tend to panic very easily. You can't control their panic reaction, unlike a horse. A horse can be trained out of its panic reaction. An elephant cannot be trained out of its panic reaction. Then the elephant will turn around and will crush its own troops. So elephants have always been a very mixed bag, unlike the horse, which never has. With a horse, all you do is you can actually charge a horse off a hill or directly to impale itself on a stake, because you put blinders on it and you just say Dodo. And it trusts the rider enough and it will impale itself on a stake. It'll be too late. Then it can't move back then, right? Or if you're fallen off a hill, there's nothing you can do. Horses are fundamentally much more reliable. So what happens is, why is it? We know Maharana Pratap's horse's name. What was the horse's name?
Chetak, no?
Chetak, exactly. Tell me, do you know Porus's horse's name? Do you know Ashoka's horse's name? Do you know Chandragupta Maurya's horse's name?
No, but Porus,
You know
I had
Samudragupta?
read it. No, I did not.
So imagine, for a animal that is so important in the Rig Veda, it shows you how all are up to that medieval period. Horses were not the core of your military strategy. Infantry and bows and arrows were. That is why Indian metallurgy developed so well as a counter cavalry strategy. That cavalry-based bowmen should not be able to defeat you. So you needed to have an extremely good shield that could withstand arrows. And your metal had to be better because you had an infantry-based strategy. Okay?
Yep.
And mind you, infantry does a brilliant job holding against cavalry. It's a question of sheer courage if you're able to hold your dhal and your spear begin, in which case cavalry charges fail. The problem is cavalry charges succeed purely because of human psychology, that you panic, you move back, the line breaks, and then the cavalry gets through. After the initial clash, which is bloody both for the horses and riders as well as infantry. And you
Yeah,
look
on
at the
the
Battle
horse.
of Tarain,
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead. Then I'll make my
huh?
point. No, no. Make your point. I'll add something later on.
So you look at the Battle of Tarain. Very curiously, the Indian strategy is a infantry-based strategy
Mm-hmm.
that fails miserably.
Mm-hmm.
So you're even, and this is the problem which comes in, that when you have birth-based lineage versus a military cratocracy. So see how everything's coming together.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm? You can you can still adopt an infantry based strategy and still lose if you're faced with a militarily superior cratocrat. So it becomes a combination of several things, and then horses take on a life of their own. This is why you are not able to withstand. Even Turkic rulers of Delhi are not able to withstand further Turkic invasions that come in. We are not able to withstand Timur. Tughlaq was a Turkic dynasty. Why did they fail so miserably to Timur? Right? The Mughals were a Mongol dynasty. Why did they fail so miserably to Nadir Shah?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a problem out here. Why does the Vijayanagar Empire constantly want to hire Turkic horsemen? It's because you've created this psychology that Hindus can't win, horses are essential for victory. You've misdiagnosed the problem, which is the Turks are winning because of horses, therefore you want horses. Plus, horses are a status symbol to elevate our elites above the foot soldier, etc., etc., etc. And for the Mongols and Turks, horses were not the elite.
Mm-hmm.
All the soldiers, the Alps, all used to ride horses. Everybody had a horse. It was just their way of fighting, and we forgot our way of fighting. We misdiagnosed the problem, and instead of refining our infantry, mind you, at the same time that these invasions are happening, Britain is not conducive to producing horses.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas France, there's a very easy supply of horses from the Pannonian Plains in Hungary and things like that. Plus, you have the French meadows where you can grow horses and things. When the Hundred Years' Wars, roughly the same time as Khiljis and Tughlaqs, happens, when Britain invades France, notice what happens at the Battle of Crécy and again 100 years later at the Battle of Agincourt.
Mm-hmm.
It's French heavy cavalry charging against British infantry and
Mm-hmm.
British bows and arrows. Because the British understood, if you don't have horses, you do the best, you fight as good as you can with what you have. Don't focus on wasting your money on shit that you can't use.
Mm-hmm.
And in both Crécy and in Agincourt, the English longbowmen just decimate the French. I think people don't realize what happens at Crécy. The entire French nobility is just wiped out. That is what infantry can do to cavalry if it wants. But that's
Yeah.
because the British didn't come from an inferiority complex. There wasn't that loss of confidence. How did Odisha manage to hold out so long against the Muslims? Why Odisha? Think about it. Because it's a very wet, rough, soft soil area, heavily, densely forested,
Horses can't
not
run properly.
suited for cavalry. So all the Odia kings, they choose infantry tactics.
Mm. Yeah.
Right? So it depends. Your tactics depend. Now, the problem is we never accumulate the kind of systematic thought that the ancient Romans and the Byzantines put into studying military strategy and passing on those lessons, we never put in. Also,
Mm-hmm.
remember, when the Turks come in, when the Muslim Turks come in, we shouldn't include the Shakas and the Hunas in this. When the Muslim Turks come in, India is completely fragmented, but there is also no identity that binds all these different kingdoms.
Mhm.
Okay? So when Muhammad Ghori, Ghazni, I keep confusing Ghazni and Ghori, sorry. If I've done that, I apologize. The earlier one was Ghazni. When
Yes.
Ghazni comes and sacks the Jyotirlinga at Somnath,
Mhm.
hmm, great Shiva Bhakta, Rajendra Chola,
Mhm.
feels absolutely no pangs. He's completely
Mhm.
unconcerned. एक
Mhm.
ज्योतिर्लिंगा टूटा तो हुआ, to quote Sam Pitroda.
Mhm.
Instead, he is preparing for a naval expedition to go sack Sri Vijaya, go over to
Mhm.
Indonesia and sack Indonesia and Malaysia.
Mhm.
तो ये हो रहा है करके also, you know that, and this is the problem in India. You see this even today, where so-called secular Indians in America, Democrat voters in India, will support Audrey Truschke
Mhm.
when she goes and bullies Hindus.
Mhm.
Tell
Yep.
me how different in this context is Rajendra Chola from your Democrat voting, Congress voting American Hindus in that sense.
Yeah, no, actually, in a way, there is a lack of strategic unity where we will deal with our issues within ourselves. But when somebody from outside comes, that I think there is a dilution of the insider outsider dichotomy which comes with assimilating and pluralistic cultures.
Exactly. Now understand the problem out here. On one hand, this is when caste is being solidified and the ban on travel comes about. You know, ye mlecha log hain, we cannot mix with them.
Mhm.
On the other, you don't even want to protect your own people against mlechas. This is the clearest sign that you have that these, you know, these doctrines of caste and purity and things, they were not evenly applied, they were not evenly seen, because intermarriage also started very early,
Yes.
right? You look at the last photos of Bahadur Shah Zafar and his son, who died in Burma.
Mhm.
वो तो तेरे से भी काले हैं बस.
Oh.
सच बोल रहा हूँ, तेरे से भी काले हैं. And here I am, a Madrasi, supposed Dravidian, who's 10 shades fairer to you, a bloody North Indian Aryan.
You have to do that.
No, but look at the idiocy of the narratives we get in school. This is the caliber of your historians in this country, yeah? They're incapable of doing a complex study of these things because they just don't do interdisciplinary shit. So what you now have is you have complex stuff. This primacy of the horse intrinsically linked with caste, an inferiority complex that sets in, which reinforces it, doubles down on the fact that you need a horse, and on top of that, complete fragmentation. The Turk understood he was a Turk, or at least he understood he was a Muslim, and you will never be a Muslim.
Mhm.
But the Hindu couldn't see that difference between Muslim and Hindu. And it lasts so late that even Shivaji doesn't see that difference. You know that famous letter he writes to Aurangzeb, he actually prefaces it saying, in the Quran it says Rabbul Alamin, not Rabbul Muslimin. So isn't he the God of all men? Don't we worship the same God? So, you know, Shivaji also did some of this Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb thing.
But okay, let me push back here. Could that be strategic planning, part of Shivaji trying to soften him up?
It could be, but remember, Shivaji was an incredibly tolerant ruler, right? He was extremely meritocratic in his promotions. He did not he wasn't a bigot. The Mughals were fundamentally bigots through and through. Because when you have a supremacist ideology, it makes you a bigot. That was very common for the time, and it's so, for me, on one hand, it's exasperating that Shivaji wasn't a bigot. And on the other hand, I'm very proud ki jo bhi hua, we retained that Shivaji stayed true to what Hinduism is about.
Yeah.
I don't like him for it, but on the other hand, you can't help but admire him for it. No?
Yeah. So Abhijit, I want to come here just to
It's
add.
complex. There's no.
Yeah, so just give me a minute. I just want to add over here because a lot of people will question you on your claim of the horse. So I just want to give it a religious sanction. So anybody who's read the Rig Veda, basically most of the horse mentions are in the new Rig Veda. For the people who don't understand, the new Rig Veda is the latter books, the new mandalas. And as you see, the horse is given a lot of importance in the Rig Veda when it starts coming, because, and the clear reason why it's given a lot of importance in the Rig Veda is because it was rare, and because it was so rare that the Ashwamedha Yajna is that. And lo and behold, if people still do not buy it, I want to tell you a little part from the Ramayana where, there is a small incident where, Lakshmana is having a conversation with someone, and there are a couple of lines which is very interesting. So Lakshmana spoke to him. The him here is Sugriva, when he's pissed off and he's going to Sugriva about why have you not fulfilled the promise. So there is just one line where Lakshmana tells him, falsehood is tantamount to killing 100 horses. That's okay. This is the interesting part. Falsehood is tantamount to killing 1,000 cows. Now, what is so interesting in this line here is that Lakshmana clearly differentiates between 100 horses and 1,000 cows. So the value of the horse is far more in terms of the cow. So what you're saying is even sanctioned in our religious text. So before people go after you and I, it's clearly mentioned in the Ramayana too. So there is a clear case where the horse is given a very elite status in Indian society from an anthropological and a sociological perspective. So I just wanted to put it out over there so that people be like, अरे अभिजीत कुछ भी बोल रहा है, no वो कुछ नहीं बोल रहा, नहीं आपने अपनी बुक्स नहीं पढ़ी, आप अगर बुक्स पढ़ोगे आपको 2 मिनट में समझ पड़ जाएगा कि the horse was rare in India. And because it was rare, it was kind of fetishized in India. So that fetish comes from that, and it is clearly visible in our religious text too.
Right. Now, the next thing that happens is technology. The earliest mention we have of gunpowder guns is in 1270 during the Mongol invasions of Japan. We actually have examples of these guns. Okay. The first example we have, we know Qutuz had a gun, and it was some kind, Baibars had a gun, and it was some kind of seen as a wonder weapon at that point of time. By 1284, we have the first mention of a gun in Italy. By the Battle of Crécy in 1300 and something, where the British infantry, where the English infantry defeated, technically the Welsh longbowmen defeat the French cavalry. The British had about 100 guns. And this is where, very curiously, churches provide the lead in Europe, taking the lead on gun technology. Do you know why? Church bells. There was a competition throughout Europe that church bells should become bigger and better, and it was a matter of pride how high your church tower will be and how big will be the bell that gets hoisted on top. And so the metallurgy went on getting better and better to serve religious needs. And the earliest gun manufacturers were bell manufacturers, because it's the same technology that gets used in making guns. By 1400, Europe is so far ahead in gun technology, it's not even funny. Right? And the Great Revolution, it was seen as the first revolution in military affairs, is when French King Henry invades Italy. He mates guns to horse carts. And so he starts off mobile artillery. And that then brings about the European fort revolution, where instead of straight walls, you go in for star forts. Now, if you look at straight walls, ऐसे अगर तुम्हारा wall है, imagine my Takla sir is the enemy, this is the defense. If you're attacking, you're climbing up the wall, I have to look down and throw things at you, and all the while the enemy is shooting arrows and catapults at me. Okay. A star fort, what does it do? It's like this. So this is, say, one star like this and one star like this, like so. Like so. If this wall is being attacked by outsiders, this wall hits the attackers with arrows in the back. Right? While being completely undercover. So it revolutionizes fort building in the 1400s in Europe. And then what happens is forts, instead of becoming high, become shorter with more prongs like this. And they become much thicker to avoid breaching, and especially because of defense against guns. Because guns could bring down a fort like that. Now, you come to India. Battle of Talikota कब हुआ था? 1500 and what?
I think 1530?
Something like that.
I think so.
You are so divorced from the outside world. The Vijayanagar military still hasn't decided on the utility of cannons. It still hasn't even decided on the utility of pairing cannons to horse carts. They had muskets. There was a large-scale musket duel and things, but it wasn't really this thing. And so muskets were there, but large guns are not. And even the Bahmani army, the combined forces of Bahmani, Golconda, etc., they use a absolutely useless, inutile cannon called the Maidane-Jung, which is so bloody big, you just can't use it. And you constantly fail to develop artillery tactics. Babur wins the Battle of Panipat against the Lodhis using artillery. And again, Ahmad Shah Abdali defeats your Marathas using mobile artillery. Or तुम इतने देर, all the way from 1500, from the Battle of Talikota to 1700, you people learn nothing. There is no absorption of military knowledge, no transmission of military knowledge, no historical transmission of military knowledge. And keep scratching your balls, doing nothing, while they produce cannonballs. And this becomes a problem. Now notice, why is it that local Turks are not able to fend off external Turks? Why does Tughlaq fail against Timur? Why does the Mughal Empire fail against Nadir Shah? Again, your cavalry focus, Mughal Empire, you're not producing cavalry. Your military tactics are all inherited Turkic cavalry military tactics. But you can't import those horses anymore, because Timur has now put in export controls for horses from Central Asia. Nadir Shah has blocked off your access to Central Asia. You can't get horses. You don't even fence yourself against export controls in those days. Now you understand why I'm telling you there are lessons here to be learned. The Indian quest for this LCA and indigenization and all that shit is a repeat of the same story as our completely bloody useless counterproductive quest for the Indian horse for 1000 years. And by Indians I mean Turks who became Indians also. They were also obsessed with this shit. You fight with what you have. And when you can't indigenize something, you shift on to the next thing. Of course, in this particular case, the indigenization has been due to a lack of again, it's the same thing. We're asking the wrong questions. Why are we not indigenizing? Arms lobby. ये टकला गंजा अभिजीत ये मदरचोद चूतिया ये इसका ये है लॉकहीड मार्टिन का एजेंट है. बाबू लोगों ने sabotage करके रखा है. That is the same shit that those kings who went on losing battles against the Turks used to say. Internal conspiracy. You don't want to look at the fact that your industrial setup and your project management is not a mirror image of the West. So you can't duplicate that product here, boss, just like you couldn't duplicate the horse in India. And the transmission of knowledge is so bad that we still don't get it. That same 1000-year horse mistake is happening now with the LCA. You tried to indigenize, ना? पहले तुमने नैट लेके हाल मारुत बनाया था, नहीं हुआ. फिर MiG-21 लेके you tried to indigenize it, उसका भी कोई indigenous plane नहीं निकला. फिर जैगुआर का तुमने किया, MiG-27 का किया, उसका भी कुछ नहीं हुआ. फिर तुमने सुखोई का किया, and we were given big promises. I wasn't alive when Jaguar and MiG licenses were taken, but I was alive when cognitive when Sukhoi licenses were taken. We were promised it will be 100% indigenous. Where is the indigenous Sukhoi? Why is China able to take 40 Sukhois, reverse engineer it, and make that exact carbon copy of the Sukhoi, but India is not? Because your industrial thing doesn't match up. And you want to blame everything except that. You want to see conspiracy theories where none exist. Mm-hmm. So all these things, this Indians viewing foreigners as okay and Indians as their biggest enemy, which is kind of the story of Amarapali and the Lichavi Confederacy as well. There's so many layers to Indian mythology which apply to reality as we know it today. There are so many of those lessons. We ask the wrong questions, we learn the wrong lessons, and this is why we're always going to be a dunce third world shithole.
All right, now let me go on to some questions because a lot of them are related anyway. So let me start. I don't know where to start. So, yeah, so this is an interesting question. Was the decline of science and technology in India only due to the Turkic invasions, or there are other factors? I think we've already touched on some of it. Or did any region except Kerala continue with the scientific tradition during medieval period?
See, science is a product of urbanization. Mm-hmm. Right? Complex science is a product of urbanization. Once you start de-urbanizing, mm-hmm. it becomes your science gets ossified at that point. As my friend mm-hmm. Sushant Sareen says, that in 700 AD, we were so taken in by our discovery of the zero that we decided to collectively reduce ourselves to zero. That was the last great Indian invention. Okay. So de-urbanization has an effect. But look, the Turkic mismanagement of the economy played a very important role. You look at how short these dynasties are, boss. They're like 20, 30, 40 years. Some of them last about 70 years most. That isn't a stable dynasty.
Mm-hmm.
You look at the coinage from the period, the value of copper in the coin, gold in the coin, silver in the coin changes year to year.
Mm-hmm.
That is not the sign of a stable economy. The
Mm-hmm.
longest period in the entire Delhi Sultanate where you have a stable metal content is during Alauddin Khilji. And that wasn't because of good economics. He was actually a terrible economist. It's just that he was a very good at war. He used to go plunder, 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 destroy other people's economy, take their surpluses, bring it home, and supplement the silver, copper, and gold content in coins.
Mm-hmm.
So
All right.
understand what
So
we were talking
okay.
about at the beginning of this podcast,
Yeah.
the Raubenwehr shaft.
Yeah. Yeah. I got it.
Acha, there's
So
this very
now.
irritating question, Vaibhav Tanwar. One second, one second. You know, this is the kind of shit that irritates me. Vaibhav Tanwar. We started reading good quality horses after the Turkic invasion. No, we did not. If you don't know about a subject, don't talk about it. We absolutely did not. The Indian horse originates sometime in the 19th century. We weren't able to domesticate a horse till the 19th century.
All right.
After that,
So
after cavalry becomes irrelevant in the battlefield.
all right. So okay. Tell me this now. Where did the question go? Now I'm confused. Okay, so somebody has asked, in the history you find nomads like Mongols and Turks destroying a well advanced civilized culture like China and Iran. So, does it prove that a society that has a mindset of expansionism is, in a way, better fit to survive?
Yes and no. Uh, Persia was an expansionist society.
Mm-hmm.
Rome was an expansionist society, and we have the concept of the third. I think the Roman Empire lasted in different forms for the longest. They were
Mm-hmm.
flexible enough to swap religions but continue as the Roman Empire. First as Rome, then as the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, and then as the Byzantine Empire. So imagine starting in about 100 BC and lasting right up to 1450 what, when Constantinople falls.
I am not good
That's
with
a very
this. I got the Talikota date wrong too. That was 1565.
65 I saw in the comments. Yeah. So imagine lasting for 1500 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's long lasting. Yes. But then look at uh, um, the Turkic dynasties in India. They were expansionist. So why were they so unstable? Why did they last for such a short time? It's we still don't understand what makes empires last long. It's usually a coming together of lot of circumstances. Remember, Timur
Mm-hmm.
wiped out the Ottoman Empire. He captured the Ottoman Sultan Bayazid, took him
Mm-hmm.
in chains back to Samarkand, and he died in Samarkand in chains. But the Ottomans came back like nobody's business in 40 years, 40, 50 years after they defeated the Battle of Ankara in what, 1402? Uh, in 1453, literally 51 years, thank you, Natal Kumar, 1453, 50 years after their state is wiped out by Timur, they capture Constantinople
Mm-hmm.
and they almost recreate the Roman Empire. They're very significant, boss. So
Mm-hmm.
why is it that Indian dynasties just collapse and the Ottoman Empire has these things? Why does the Roman Empire continue so long? We don't know. I haven't gone into this. Let's see. I mean, I don't know.
All right. So you once said it was the British who destroyed the Mughal noble rule, and that this persisted even during the Marathas. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
I wouldn't have said that, boss.
I don't know. Somebody has
I
asked
think
this
you're
question that you.
misinterpreting what I said. I think you're misinterpreting what I said. It was the Marathas who defeated the Mughals.
Yeah.
Remember, when the British took over India was the vast majority of the Indian subcontinent was back in Hindu hands.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
Okay,
I
almost two
agree.
thirds of India of the subcontinent was back in Hindu hands. So I wouldn't have said that.
All right. So, all right. I'm just trying to find. Okay, somebody has asked what today what you spoke, was it a part of your PhD thesis?
Sorry, you broke up.
So today, the topic that you're covering today, that we are covering today, was any of it part of your PhD thesis?
No, but my PhD thesis actually plays into it, because my PhD thesis is, why do Indian hardware purchases not translate into operational gains?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that is to say, why do we keep purchasing stuff and we never seem to use it as effectively as the original user does? And a lot of it, it because I was forced to read a lot about historicity of this subject and create other, explore other historical instances where similar things had happened. And yes, that played. So my PhD played a role in this. This doesn't play into my PhD, no.
Actually, this is a very good question, Abhijit. Somebody has asked this. Why did the Turks adopt the Hanafi school of Islam, which is which is the most tolerant towards infidels, if Islam was guiding their expansionist ideology? What do you have to say to that?
They did not. Who told you they adopted? See, when you use Turks, be clear which Turks.
Hmm.
If you look at Oghuz Turks, the Turkomans follow different schools. Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan is Shia. In fact, the ruler of Iran even today is a bloody Turk. Ayatollah Khamenei is not Iranian; he's an Azeri, and Azeri
Mm-hmm.
are Oghuz Turks. Okay, they're Shia.
Mm-hmm.
Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, adopted Hanafism. Why? Because it suited the caliph, and it suited his whole. After it becomes, this caliphate. First, it was the inherited doctrine which they converted to when they were wandering, and second, it also helped them because when you're running a multi-ethnic empire like the Ottoman Empire, it helps a lot.
Mm-hmm.
When you don't want to be a bigot, when you want to temper down your bigotry, the jurisprudence gives you enough room to do it. Unlike Wahhabi jurisprudence that would not allow, well, Salafi jurisprudence which would not allow you to do it. Second, remember the big fight at that point within Sunnism was between the Hanafi and the Salafi.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. Uh, and specifically, what is the main thing? See, the Hanbali school within Salafism, which is the most popular, from which Wahhabism and everything come about.
Mm-hmm.
Why did the Hanbali school become so popular? Who's the founder of the Hanbali school? Ibn Taymiyyah. And
Yeah.
he comes up with this notion of takfir, taken from kafir, but takfir. Why? Because he sees all these Turks and Mongols. He's writing, remember, after the Mongols sack Baghdad.
Mm-hmm.
1257, I think, uh, or 1258. So he sees these people as lesser Muslims, that racism creeps into Islam, that a native Arab interpretation will
Mm-hmm.
always be superior to a non-Arab interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, almost in a counter reaction, it becomes easier for and more to their self-image and for their self-respect for them to choose the Hanafi school than to choose the Salafi school. It's circumstance. It's not deliberate decision. Just like the other Turkomans, the Safavids, accidentally were born Shia, and they became great. right? So even within the Turkomans, you have different schools. Karlukids different, Kipchaks different. Everything is different. There's no uniform Turkic adherence to the Hanafi school.
All right. So I have a couple of more questions. So this is actually, we've kind of dealt with it, so I'll still read it. I think it kind of, you did cover it when you were talking about even modern technology in this Vishwaguru self-image, which focuses on idealism and grandeur but ignores problems at hand. Does it result in always hitting a moving target without any results? And is such ineffectiveness basically a cultural trait on in a significant level of our history? I think we covered this, but in a way, it does make sense, right?
If Vishwaguru, not Vista Guru, I'm assuming Vishwaguru self-image is focused on. Yeah, look, we're always about this. We're always about this. You know, for example, when you're talking about the protein deficiency in India, there is no debate on protein deficiency in India. There is only a debate on if Akshay Patra should be serving eggs in India. The student and the protein deficiency be damned, anda hona chahiye. So we're focusing on this grandeur. We're essentially a snake oil salesman that way. You're not focusing on the ways and means, you're focusing on the marketing pitch.
Mm-hmm. All right, then suggest scholarly readings on Indian history. Go for it, Abhijit. Suggest scholarly readings on Indian history. His internet is gone.
You, you know, the surprising thing is, there is no scholarly reading on Indian history, boss. You have to read hundreds and hundreds of journal articles, not about India, to understand India. Because even today, every description of industrialization in pre-British India follows that idiot Irfan Habib's model, which talks about scale and not about the application of chemical energy to the production process.
Mm-hmm.
Industrialization, the accepted definition of industrialization, is the application of chemical energy to the production process, not the fact that you ran a sweatshop full of 500,000 slaves. That's not industrialization.
Hmm.
So, you know,
So
you have
why
to
didn't?
read some other book to realize that Irfan Habib and his entire brood, and indeed everybody who writes about Indian industrialization, gets their fundamental definition wrong. So, you know, read as much as you can. What I do is, I don't read newspapers. I do not have a TV at home. I do not subscribe to newspapers. I only glance through news websites every now and then. What I do is, I have an Athena Blackwell, a JSTOR subscription. And every day I read 3 journal articles, completely diverse. It'll be on the food habits of pre-Columbian Patagonians to Siberian art in the Stone Age. You never know where you get information from. The question is, how do you connect the dots?
All right, so
Why didn't
why
the
didn't the
Industrial
industrial
Revolution?
and the Renaissance happen in Europe and not in Asia?
Very good question. There's actually a book about this.
Mm-hmm.
It's called Why the West Rules for Now by Ian Morris.
Yeah.
I suggest you look it up. And you combine that with a book that Kushal actually recommended to me, which has become my favorite. So Ian Morris is my all-time favorite history author because he gives you the macro narrative. So recommendation to everyone: Ian Morris, Why the West Rules for Now. And the second is, you have to understand how the psychology of the West diverged 1,000 years back. And that's Joseph Henrich, Weird People.
Yeah.
Read that book. See, like I said, the answer to the previous question, you get the answers from different places. It's like military tactics. You should never attack your enemy head on. You always do oblique attack. Even information is a war, and your information comes through oblique angles.
All right. If indigenization of fighter deaths, that is LCA Tejas, is a repeat of past blunders, what is the remedy for the same, and how can we solve this in the next decade?
So the solution to the Tejas doesn't lie in the Tejas. The solution to the Tejas lies in your economy and your education. 4 बार 4 5 बार कितने बार ट्राई किया, कितने प्लेन्स को लेके डोमेस्टिकली प्रोड्यूस किया, नैट को मारुत बनाया, मिग 21, मिग 27, जैगुआर, सुखोई और कुछ था क्या, एनीवे एटलीस्ट 5, और फिर भी तुम नहीं कर पाए हो. So the solution is not direct, oblique. You have to improve your education system. You have to improve your public accountability system, or failing that, you give it to the private sector. You have to get out of the socialist mindset. ठीक है?
All right.
That is the solution. Privatize.
All right. Are R.S. Sharma and Satish Chandra reliable sources of ancient and medieval Indian history?
I might have read them, but the name doesn't strike me. If I had gotten anything from them, their name would have stuck with me. So clearly it didn't. So I don't know.
Yeah, so I think we've pretty much covered. Okay, I wanted to leave this one last question. I can't share it on the screen, Abhijit, because it was asked far early in the chat. So this was for both of us. So somebody had asked, who is your favorite Indian king? So I want you to answer this first. I can always answer it later on.
My favorite Indian king. My favorite Indian king is Jesus, our Lord in Christ, anointed by God, the King of Kings. And I hope all you heathen native savages embrace our Lord in Christ. He is the King of India. He's the King of Kings.
You had to do that. Well, I'll give you my answer.
Okay, serious answer. Okay, serious answer. Can I give the serious answer now?
Yeah, they.
Can I get 2 choices?
Yeah, sure.
One would be Shivaji, and the second would be Chandragupta Maurya.
Yeah, so in my case, I don't have 2 choices. I just have one choice, and I'll explain my reasoning for that. Is the reason Shivaji is the greatest Indian king ever was not only was he brave, he was victorious, and that I think is a distinguishing factor between a lot of Indian kings. See, I always give the analogy of this very weird Bollywood movie China Gate, where there was this villain Jagira who fights with the professor, and he kills the professor, and then he tells the professor that, "Bhai professor, tum bahadiri to bahut le aaye, tum kaminapan kahan se laoge?" What I love about Shivaji was his street smartness. And he'll bend the rules when he had to bend the rules. He would go he would go around the ulta rasta if he had to defeat someone, which is why I think in Indian history Shivaji was the quintessential Indian hero, and he actually taught us the art of winning. How we wish we could learn from him, we never do.
See, you have to be brave and be a winner. Nobody has any use for a brave loser. Just like people only remember who won the Nobel Prize, they don't care about who was the runner-up for the Nobel Prize. Everybody only remembers the gold medal. Nobody remembers who won the silver medal.
Yeah. All right, Abhijit, I think we'll wrap up today's discussion, but this is by far not going to be the only discussion we're going to do today, because I know your internet is also acting up a little bit. So let me wrap it up for the day. So before we wrap today's discussion, any passing comments?
Well, vetri well.
All right, guys. So let's wrap up today's discussion. I tried to take all your questions because a lot of your super chats were basically comments and not questions. So I could not ask them honestly. They were just basically agreeing or adding to what Abhijit had already mentioned. But as always, it's always a pleasure to chat with Abhijit, and I'll try to make this into some sort of a series where Abhijit and I, we pick up weird topics from Indian history, and Abhijit and I have one thing in common. We both like to look at different aspects of history and analyze them. I try to bring in the religious and philosophical angle, and Abhijit always brings in the historical angle and the anthropological angle. So we kind of gel very well together, because I can always tell Abhijit what the philosophers said and what the religious text says, and Abhijit can always bring in the other side. So I think it makes a very good combination, and we'll try to do more of these discussions. So we'll wrap up today's chat, and I'll see you guys next time. So take care, everyone, and please like the video, subscribe to the channel, share the video, leave your comments, and become a member on Patreon or YouTube or wherever you want to join and support the podcast. Until then, take care. Namaste. See you next time.
वेल वेल वेट वेल वेल वेट्री वेल एंड रिमेंबर, अयोध्या तो बस झांकी है, काशी मथुरा बाकी है. डोंट
Jai
स्लीप.
Shri Ram.